Hello everyone, this is Professor Kuehn once again, and welcome back to my lectures on astronomy. We have just finished our study of Johannes Kepler and his Epitome of Copernican Astronomy, where he reviews the ideas of Copernicus, specifically Copernicus's heliocentric worldview. For the most part, Kepler agreed with many of the things that Copernicus taught, but he had certain notable exceptions, namely, most importantly perhaps, that the planets are not moving in these spherical or circular orbits around the sun, rather they're in these elliptical orbits. So that opens a can of worms, because if they're not moving in circular orbits, you can't inherit all of the kind of machinery that was developed by Aristotle and others earlier on in order to explain why the planets are moving. So it really opens up the door to speculation about the cause of motion of the planets themselves, and that really eventually leads to the universal law of gravitation that we'll talk about in maybe next week, that was developed by Isaac Newton. So one of the contemporaries of Johannes Kepler was Galileo Galilei. You've probably heard of him before, just usually referred to as Galileo. And one of his most famous works is called the Sidereal Messenger. And what I want to do today is I'm going to start, I don't ordinarily do this, but I'm going to just start reading through this chapter with you and commenting here and there, because there's a lot in here that I'd like to point out. So for the next couple of lectures, I'm going to be reading this with you and pointing out things as we go along. Okay, and we'll see how this goes. So this is on page 227 in A Student's Guide to the Great Physics Text, Volume 1. So we are beginning with this introduction. The quote says, "It is most beautiful and pleasing to the eye to look upon the lunar body," that is the moon, "distant from us about 60 terrestrial diameters." That means it's about 60 times as far away from us as the diameter of the Earth itself is. So about 60 terrestrial diameters, from so near as if it were distant by only 2 of these measures. So this is a quote from what we're about to read, and he is saying he can see it very close up because he's using a telescope. And that's one of the things that Galileo is most famous for. So Galileo was born in the city of Pisa. As a young boy, he attended a monastery school where he studied Latin classics and Greek. He went on to study medicine and mathematics at the University of Pisa, but he left without a degree due to lack of funds, so he ran out of money. After this, he spent a few years doing private teaching and independent research. Then he went on to serve as a lecturer at the University of Pisa before he was appointed to the chair of mathematics at the University of Padua in 1591. It was here that he carried out the work which would be published in 1610 under the title Sidereus Nuncius, which means the sidereal or starry messenger. So if any of you have studied any Latin, sideres means star in Latin, and nuncius means like announcer or messenger. Why is it called this, by the way? Because you can think about this as, what message do you get from looking at the stars carefully, or what do the stars tell us? So the sidereal messenger. The following text selections were translated from Latin, that's the language that Galileo wrote in, by Edward Stafford Carlos in 1880, and then it was revised by Maurice Finocchiaro in 2008. That's the English translation we're reading. Galileo's sketches of the moon I got from some nice folks over at the University of Iowa who forwarded on some very nice photographs of Galileo's sketches that I've included in this text. As a result of this publication of the Sidereal Messenger, Galileo was appointed philosopher and chief mathematician to the Grand Duke of Tuscany, which provided him with leisure and salary conducive to carrying out extensive research and writing. Subsequently, his strident defense, or very strong defense, of Copernican heliocentrism, coupled with his trenchant attacks, or very pointed attacks, on Aristotelian teachings or doctrines, led to conflict with academic and ecclesiastical authorities, and his eventual trial before the Roman Inquisition. And during this trial, he was found guilty of not heresy, but vehement suspicion of heresy. And he was sentenced to house arrest in the city of Florence. And while he was under house arrest in Florence, he wrote another famous book that is his study of the strength of materials and projectile motion, like artillery. And that's a book that we read selections from in my Physics 201 and 151 class. Okay? So this book that we're looking at, or the text we're looking at today, is his astronomical work, his Sidereal or Starry Messenger. And in this book, he reports on his measurements using a telescope of the mountains on the moon and his observations of things like the Milky Way galaxy and his discovery of the moons of Jupiter, Io, Ganymede, Europa, and Callisto, the 4 biggest moons of Jupiter. Okay, so let's go ahead and start into the text. So he begins with a dedication. You might remember that when we read Copernicus, he begins with a dedication to one of the popes, Pope Leo. And then when we read Kepler, he did a preface to the reader explaining what he was trying to accomplish. And here, once again, in Galileo, we have a dedication. And it's important to note that one of the reasons why Galileo could carry out his scientific work is because he was paid by the Medici family, a very wealthy family in Florence, a banking family at the time. They funded his work, and so he's basically writing this in honor of them. So he says, he's explaining this here, so I'll go ahead and read. He says, "There is certainly something very noble and humane in the intention of those who have endeavored to protect from envy the noble achievements of distinguished men, and to rescue their names worthy of immortality from oblivion and decay." So he's saying there's something really good about remembering people who have done great things. "This desire has given us the images of famous men sculpted in marble or fashioned in bronze as a memorial of them to future ages. To the same feeling we owe the erection of statues, both ordinary and equestrian, like statues with people on horses. Hence, as the poet says, has originated expenditure mounting to the stars upon columns and pyramids. With this desire, lastly, cities have been built, and distinguished by the names of those men whom the gratitude of posterity thought worthy of being handed down to all ages. For the state of the human mind is such that, unless it be continually stirred by the likenesses of things obtruding themselves upon it from without, all recollection of them easily passes away from it." So what is he saying in this paragraph? If you look at it carefully, first of all, it's the language is very elevated. Notice that. So if you're finding this to be a bit challenging to read, it's because Galileo writes in a very literary style, which you can get used to, but it takes some getting used to if you're not accustomed to this kind of thing. What is he saying here? He's saying that people are remembered by having their names or they're being remembered by having statues erected in their honor, or even pyramids or buildings or even cities named after them. Think about Alexandria, the city, or the state of Virginia, after the Virgin Queen of England. So we have all these different states and cities and things to remember the names of people who had a profound effect upon our history. Okay? And then he goes on to say, "Others, however, having regard for more stable and more lasting monuments, secured the eternity of the fame of great men by placing it under the protection not of marble or bronze," that is, not having bronze or marble statues made, "but of the Muses' guardianship and the imperishable monuments of literature." So some people, instead of having statues erected in their honor, they have poems or stories written about them. Think about Homer's Odyssey, which is an account of the exploits of Odysseus, right, on his travel back from the city of Troy, which he'd conquered. He says, "But why do I mention these things? As if human wit, content with these regions, did not dare to advance further. Whereas, since it well understood that all human monuments do perish at last by violence, by weather, or by age, it took a wider view and invented more imperishable signs over which destroying time and envious age could claim no rights. So, betaking itself to the sky, it inscribed on the well-known orbs of the brightest stars, those everlasting orbs, the names of those who, for eminent and godlike deeds, were accounted worthy to enjoy an eternity in company with the stars. Wherefore the fame of Jupiter, Mars, Mercury, Hercules, and the rest of the heroes, by whose names the stars are called, will not fade until the extinction of the splendor of the constellations themselves." So what is he pointing out here? Well, you probably can see this yourself. He's saying some people have memorials erected to them in bronze and marble as statues. Some have stories written about them, like the Odyssey or other epic poems. But some have had even constellations or stars or planets named after them. So these famous Roman or Greek heroes or gods had planets named after them. So their memorials are even more, last even longer than decaying marble or buildings or pyramids or even poems. Okay? And he says these won't pass away until the constellations themselves pass away. He goes on to say, but this invention of human shrewdness, so this is kind of a shrewd way of having this memorial, this invention of human shrewdness, so particularly noble and admirable, has gone out of date ages ago, inasmuch as primeval heroes are in possession of those bright abodes and keep them by a sort of right. So we remember these ancient heroes by the stars and the planets, but we've kind of, this practice of naming stars and planets after heroes has gone out of practice. After all, most of the planets are kind of taken by those. Into such company the affection of Augustus in vain attempted to introduce Julius Caesar, for when he wished that the name Julian should be given to a star that appeared in his time, one of those which the Greeks and the Latins alike name from their hair-like tails, comets, it vanished in a short time and mocked his too eager hope. So apparently Augustus tried to introduce a star by the name of Julius Caesar, but it ended up being a comet, it vanished, and that was kind of a failure because it went away, kind of like Julius Caesar did. But we are able to prophesize far truer and happier things for your highness, most serene prince, for scarcely have the immortal graces of your mind begun to shine on earth when bright stars present themselves in the heavens like tongues to tell and celebrate your most eminent virtues to all time. So here now he's turning this and he's saying, now I'm writing to you, Medici. So this is written, remember, to Serene Cosimo II de Medici, 4th Grand Duke of Tuscany. This is a letter to him. He said, most serene prince, addressing Medici, that we're in luck here because there are some new planets or new stars that have appeared recently. And Galileo is going to go on to say, I'm going to name these stars after you in your honor. He says, like tongues to tell and celebrate your most eminent virtues to all time. Behold then, reserved for your famous name 4 stars, belonging not to the ordinary and less distinguished multitude of the fixed stars, but to the illustrious order of the planets. Like genuine children of Jupiter, they accompany their orbital revolutions around this most noble star with mutually unequal motions and with marvelous speed, and at the same time altogether in common accord, they also complete every 12 years great revolutions around the center of the world, certainly around the sun itself. So what Galileo is going to say is that he, by looking through his telescope, was recently able to observe for the very first time 4 tiny new, he says, stars that are in the vicinity of Jupiter. These end up being the 4 moons of Jupiter, right? So he discovered these 4 moons of Jupiter that are moving very quickly around the Jupiter, in the vicinity of Jupiter, and they're following Jupiter through the zodiac as Jupiter makes its way through the entire zodiac every 12 years. That's because it's orbiting the sun every 12 years. And Galileo is going to point out that Mr. Prince Medici, you're in luck because I'm going to name these after you, and they're not going to pass away like a comet did when Augustus tried to name a comet after Julius Caesar. He goes on to say, but the maker of the stars himself, and this is interesting, the maker of the stars himself seemed to direct me by clear reason to assign these new planets to the famous name of your highness in preference to all others. So he's calling them planets, right? Because they're kind of like planets in the sense that they're orbiting around Jupiter. We usually call them the moons of Jupiter, but he's referring to them as planets here. For just as these stars, and he also calls them stars, for just as these stars, like children worthy of their sire, never leave the side of Jupiter by any appreciable distance, they're always kind of close to Jupiter, so who does not know that clemency, kindness of heart, gentleness of manners, splendor of royal blood, nobility in public functions, wide extent of influence and power over others, all of which have fixed their common abode and seat in your highness, who, I say, does not know that all these qualities, according to the providence of God, from whom all good things do come, emanate from the benign star of Jupiter. So all these kinds of great qualities that, by the way, Prince Medici, you have, they come from the star Jupiter. Jupiter, I maintain, at the instant of the birth of your highness, having at length emerged from the turbulent mists of the horizon and occupying the middle quarter of the heavens and illuminating the eastern angle from his own royal house, from that exalted throne Jupiter looked out upon your most happy birth and poured forth into a most pure air all the brightness of his majesty, in order that your tender body and your mind, already adorned by God with still more splendid graces, might imbibe with your first breath the whole of that influence and power. Notice what he's doing here. If this sounds a little bit like astrology, you're right. Galileo is basically saying that when Prince Medici was born, that was the time that Jupiter was rising in the east. And because Jupiter was rising, that was a sign, and it gave him certain qualities. Because where the stars are located in the heavens, it was thought by Galileo and many others, that had an effect on your character. That's the essence of astrology that he is talking about here. But why should I use only probable arguments when I can demonstrate my conclusion with an almost necessary reason? It was the will of the Almighty God that I should be judged by your most serene parents not unworthy to be employed in teaching mathematics to your highness. So Galileo says, I'm lucky to be your math teacher, which duty I discharged during the 4 years just past, at that time of the year when it is customary to relax from more severe studies. Wherefore, since it fell to my lot, evidently by God's will, to serve your highness, and so to receive the rays of your incredible clemency and beneficence in a position near your person, what wonder is it if you have so warmed my heart, that it thinks not scarcely about anything else by day and night, but how I, who am under your dominion not only by the inclination, but also by my very birth and nature, may be known to be most anxious for your glory and most grateful to you? So he's saying, I have had the honor of serving as your mathematics teacher, and I am under your beneficence, under your kind of good graces and your protection. So remember, the Medici family is a family that's taking care of Galileo, paying for him, caring for him in their lands and their principality. And so Galileo is honored by this, and he's basically singing the praises of the Medici family for these kinds of things. He says then, and so inasmuch as under your auspices, most serene Cosimo, I have discovered these stars which were unknown to all astronomers before me, I have with very good right determined to designate them with the most august name of your family. And as I was the first to investigate them, who can rightly blame me if I give them a name and call them the Medicean stars, hoping that as much consideration may accrue to these stars from this title as other stars have brought to other heroes. For not to speak of your most serene ancestors, to those everlasting glory the monuments of all history bear witness, your virtue alone, most mighty hero, can confer on those stars an immortal fame. So he's saying, I am going to name these 4 planets, these 4 new stars, these 4 moons of Jupiter, the Medicean stars. And that way, your name will be remembered, your family name will be remembered forever. Now, it's interesting to point out that you've probably never heard of the Medicean stars. You've probably heard of the moons of Jupiter. Maybe you've heard of what they're called now, Ganymede, Io, Callisto, Europa, right? So they're no longer referred to as the Medicean stars. So even what Galileo is trying to do here kind of passed away, at least in popular culture. So what he was trying to do is give the Medici family an immortal name. It didn't exactly work. He says, similarly, who can doubt that you will not only maintain and preserve the expectations, high though they be, about yourself, which you have aroused by the very happy beginning of your government, but that you will also far surpass them, so that when you have conquered your peers, you may well vie with yourself and become day by day greater than yourself in your greatness? Accept then, most clement prince, this addition to the glory of your family, reserved by the stars for you, and may you enjoy for many years those good blessings which are sent to you not so much from the stars as from God, the maker and governor of the stars. Your Highness's most devoted servant, Galileo Galilei, in Padua on 12 March 1610. So you'll see Galileo is really laying it on pretty thick here. But keep in mind that, Galileo is not a rich man. He's not someone who is going to be able to give money in exchange for the kind of benefits he's received from the prince. What he does have is words. And so what he's doing is he's giving a dedication. That's something he can offer in return for all the kindness that the prince's family has shown to Galileo. And that's exactly what he's doing here. Another thing that you might find difficult about this is Galileo's seeming adherence to astrology, right? So astrology is something that Galileo talks about in this and says it actually has the locations of the stars have an effect on the prince, on the character of people. And this is a very common view at this time. And in fact, it's a common view today as well. So maybe I'll say one thing about this. Keep in mind that the stars do have an effect on you, right? So they govern our calendars and make us decide when to plant crops. So where the heavenly bodies, where the stars, the moon, the sun are in the sky, they do govern our society in a certain way. They do have an effect on our actions and when we choose to do things, whether it's planting crops or getting ready for winter and so on. So at the very least, they do have an effect on us. The question is only to what extent is the effect that they have on us. And these people like Galileo thought that the stars had a much larger effect on us and on our character than probably many people do today. Keep in mind also that the idea that physical objects have an effect on your character is not so foreign even today. You'll probably have heard statements like, that person is a mean person. It's just in his genes, right? It's part of his DNA. Now, I'm pretty sure that no one has found a gene or DNA that actually can be traced to you being a mean person. But there's this sort of faith that we have today that our genetics are determinant of our character. And that is a view that is not scientifically well-founded at this point, at least. And so, at the very least, our language and our expectations is that there is a physical basis for our character. At least among many scientists, that's the view. And that's not so different from what they're doing back then. They're saying the stars, these physical things, do have some impact on our character. That was kind of the genetics of the olden days. Okay, so maybe that'll help you kind of think about how they're thinking about this, or maybe it'll make you reevaluate the way we think about things today.